Welcome back again with Jack and Jordan here, Pre-Focus Solutions and Culture Brand, just really expanding on the actual identification of branding. So I'll let Jack kind of take it away here on his main elements, and then I'll recap with how you put that into a presentation form to encompass all the above.
Well, Jordan, one of the places where I see tremendous weakness in most branding approaches is it only appeals to the eyes. Scientists tell us that we have far more neural synapses devoted to processing language, to verbal processing, than we do to visual processing. Now, I don't want to drill down into the technical details, and there are going to be people who argue with me about that. But I've studied enough about it to know that that's the case. So remember, the goal of branding is very concrete. It's not fuzzy, it's concrete. The goal is I want to get more money out of every customer for the rest of their life so that I can drive down my customer acquisition costs and drive up the lifetime value of a customer. That's the purpose. So how do we do that? Well, it starts by creating an emotional connection with your customer. They're not going to stick with you forever. They're not going to stick with you through thick and thin just because you've got the best price, because somebody else will come along with a better price. So how do we get to them emotionally? Well, it's a many layered approach, but at the very minimum, and that's what I want to talk about, is the minimum elements of great branding. You've got to have both the visual element and the verbal element. Now, that's more than merely having pictures and having logos. You've got to have the type of images and the type of verbal messages that attack the emotional area of the human being, that causes them to want to be connected to you. There's a whole lot of branding out there, visual, that's incredibly weak. For example, neuroscientists tell us we do not bond emotionally with objects nearly as strongly as we bond with faces. So from a visual standpoint, an abstract visual logo doesn't have the emotional bonding power of a logo that has a face in it. And let's leave the word logo out. You don't even need to have a logo as long as you're presenting a visual that has some sort of face, some sort of recognizable persona. We know this from cognitive science that emotionally, that's how human beings respond. So you're really doing yourself a disservice if you take the element of a face out of your branding efforts. And in this high-tech world, there's an awful lot of companies that have done that. They use abstract design elements, or sometimes alphabet, symbols. All of that's good. It's better than nothing. But if you want to take it to the next level, take it to the pinnacle, you've got to have the visuals that incorporate the kinds of things that human beings react to at a gut level. The reality is, faces attract us far more than anything else. So that's the visual side. And then the verbal side.
Well, I think, if you don't mind if I jump in.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
I think, and just to touch on, in case you missed some of the last episodes or even the first, diluted conversation we had, I think, when we talked about faces or talking about a recognizable icon, even, it's something that you really determine when you immerse yourself in that development phase of the why behind your brand, the origin story, the purpose of what you're doing, that mold of, the entity that you're providing consumers with. When you take the time to discover that stuff, that face value, I like to call it, it becomes clear. And when that becomes clear to you, and not necessarily what you want to promote or design, what you identify with as a business owner, then that is how it becomes clear to the consumers that you want to target.
One of the best illustrations of this I've seen, George Zimmer from the Men's Wearhouse. Remember him?
George Zimmerman? I'm just kidding.
George Zimmer, Men's Warehouse. He used to say when he was, his face was always in their advertisements,
Hmm.
and he would end his advertisements with, I think it was, you're gonna look great. I'm George Zimmer, and I guarantee it," or something like that. When Men's Warehouse was bought by Joseph A. Banks, one of the first things they did was get rid of George Zimmer. George Zimmer as a face disappeared from Men's Warehouse. I would like to recommend anybody watching our videos now, pay attention to Men's Warehouse ads, especially those of you who remember George Zimmer. Compare the emotional component of those Men's Warehouse ads or the Joseph A. Banks ads to the old Men's Warehouse ads that had George Zimmer. There was a tremendous ability to connect emotionally. Pay attention to your own responses when you see that. It has nothing to do with the fact that George Zimmer had an interesting voice or an interesting face. That didn't matter. What mattered is the comparison between there was a face of Men's Warehouse
that people could relate to,
that created an emotional connection. And yes, George Zimmer also verbally had a good message that we got the verbal input. But I see this over and over again where companies, they've got a face, somebody that there's some sort of visual face, recognizable persona that we can identify with, and then they get rid of it for God knows why. They didn't have to get rid of George Zimmer just because he was no longer part of the company. They took away the emotional hook. When you walked into a Men's Warehouse store, you used to kind of feel like you were walking into George's store, even though George was literally just the face of this giant public corporation. It really wasn't George's store, but it created that emotional, personal connection. That's the kind of thing that creates lifetime customer values that are going up, customer acquisition costs that go down. And that's just on the visual side. There's another order of magnitude more on the verbal side, because we have far more neural synapses designed for processing language than we do for processing images.
Mm-hmm.
So those two elements, you got to be really, really careful. What is it you present visually? What is it you present verbally? Are they consistent? And are they striking the emotional elements that you intend to strike?
Mm-hmm. That's why even I recommend that, clients, when you're establishing your brand for the first time, like, you don't even really have to settle on a catchphrase or a slogan right away. Let it settle, let you figure out, what your share is, I guess, of the market, but who identifies with you, and let that mold itself. I think, people are, like we keep touching on, they're so stuck on that process that they have to do this first and this second, and they have to have the design. And sometimes, you have to have that discovery. And it may cause you to be impatient because you want results now. But in the long run, that's what we talked in the last podcast about, envisioning that end goal first, because it's what you're chasing. You're chasing those loyal customers that identify with you right away, and they stick with you throughout, no matter what pivot you make, because you're identifying with them in the specificity of what their need is.
And Jordan, what you just said is so valuable. No matter what pivot you make, the reality is the external circumstances of the marketplace are going to continually change. They've changed for every year that humanity has been alive. There's no reason to think that once you've achieved a certain level of success, the market is suddenly going to become static. It's always going to change. That means you're always going to have to change how you deal with that market. And that's why this kind of hook their hearts branding is so terribly important. They'll stick with you through the pivots if you've created this emotional, personal connection with your brand that holds them. If you don't, you'll lose them, and most companies do.
And I think that's, when you touch on Men's Warehouse changing to probably just a standard logo, I think they just have the MW, right?
Yeah.
I think they really just transitioned to what everybody else is doing. I don't know as if they even had any substance behind that switch. And I think that really ties into a lot of the things we say, where you're trying to have your customers identify with a brand, actual like branded logo,
Yeah,
like,
with a logo.
like
Nobody
my
cares.
team. But you know what I mean? Instead of branding, branding them as your customers, I think, and sometimes it's really hard to explain this. So hopefully we're doing a great job. But identifying your persona allows you to identify who speaks that persona, how you present that persona, what the visual identity is, and then the messaging, the corresponding messaging. And you can't waver from that, because as soon as you waver from it, people view that as change, and they don't view you as consistent or trustworthy, which if you're not pushing or advertising your ability to be trustworthy, how can you drive loyalty?
Exactly. And that's a fertile field for conversation there.
Yeah. And I didn't mean to jump into brand persona, but I think,
absolutely. That's good
the
stuff.
main elements is always going to be, I think its origin is huge. I have my why, you have your why, Jack, your experience is vast, and you're finding that your passion in this field, just as I've had my experience where I've seen customers upset or not get the results they need because they're put right into a process that their competitors are doing. Or, you have a pet company that's doing the same thing as an industrial company, and that stuff doesn't work. And you're just throwing money into the standardized process instead of really harnessing that value and that persona and that why you started, and then conveying that adequately to the audience that wants to hear it. People are so afraid that, I'm going to make myself vulnerable, or my audience doesn't want to hear it, or this isn't important, or I can't be transparent, it's too risky. So what else is risky? Being the same as somebody else? That gives people choices. So I don't mind getting up here, whether people think I'm bashing agencies or bashing the marketing or branding process in general. That's not what it's about.